Hello, everyone. I'm Philip Yun, CEO of World Affairs. On behalf of World Affairs, the Pacific Council on International Policy, I'm pleased to welcome you all to our program today, Hope Amid Uncertainty, the Future of Afghanistan. Joining us for this event are former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, former EU High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, Federica Mogherini, and the CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Stephen Heintz. This is the fourth program in our 2021 Global Leader Series presented jointly by World Affairs and the Pacific Council on International Policy. I also wanted to be sure to thank the Iran Project, in particular my very good friend, Ambassador Bill Luers, and Katia Meade for their efforts to bring conversations like these to the forefront. So let's quickly set the stage. President Biden's decision to pull remaining American military personnel from Afghanistan by September 11th opens a window of uncertainty for the stability and future of the country, and I think especially for Afghan women and the younger generation. And I sadly note that a girls' school was bombed in Kabul just a few days ago, something that can get lost in all the craziness that's going on in the world right now. So to help us better understand what is at stake, and most importantly, what we might be able to do moving forward, it's my really great pleasure to introduce today's distinguished panel. Madeleine Albright is a professor, author, diplomat, and businesswoman. In 1997, she became the first female Secretary of State and became, at that time, the highest ranking woman in the history of the US government. And I have to say, I had the great pleasure of working for her during that time. In 2012, President Obama awarded Secretary Albright the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian honor in recognition of her contributions to international peace and democracy. Federica Mogherini is the rector of the College of Europe. In January 2020, she became the co-chair of the United Nations High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement. And previously, she served as the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and as Vice President of the European Commission from 2014 to 2019. And moderating today's conversation, I'm pleased to introduce Stephen Heintz, the president and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. RBF works to build a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world through its considerable grant-making activities. Among his many accomplishments, Stephen led RBF's joint initiative started in 2002 to open a Track 2 dialogue that laid the groundwork for what would become the Iran nuclear deal. Stephen has been engaged in Afghanistan-related work since 2011, and as such, RBF, in partnership with the Atlantic Council, is a major force behind the strategic dialogue that produced the Transatlantic Charter on Afghan Sovereignty, Security, and Development. And we have the key players involved with that dialogue and that document. And so I will leave it to them to tell you more about that. So I want to thank all of you, our distinguished panelists, for being here. And Stephen, I'll leave it all to you.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. And let me express our thanks to World Affairs and the Pacific Council for hosting this very timely event. As you indicated in your introduction, the world is a complicated place. And while we are focused this morning and this afternoon on Afghanistan, the events in the Middle East as we speak also are on all of our minds. And I thought we might just take a minute to start with that and ask both Secretary Albright and Rector Mogherini for their assessment of the violence in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, and what you see as the path forward from this loss of life on both sides and from the chaos that it has the potential to produce. So Secretary Albright, how do you assess the situation?
Well, the only word I think that works is tragedy in so many different ways, because we have seen on TV the kind of destruction that is taking place, the escalation of the problem between various groups, both among the Palestinians and among the Israelis. And so It is a very dangerous situation. I unfortunately have witnessed this kind of thing before, and it has led to more deaths and killing. And so I think the important thing is for all of us to make it clear that de-escalation is the only thing that is going to solve what is clearly an existential problem in so many different ways.
Director Mogherini, I wonder whether you think this new round of violence, which puts the Middle East and Middle East peace squarely back on the agenda, does it open up any path for a new round of diplomacy toward some kind of long-term solution?
It should, Stephen, because as Madeleine mentioned, this is not something new. We've seen this again and again, and we know where it leads. It leads to more violence. It leads to losing more lives on both sides, including some dramatic scenes we've seen on both sides in these hours. So what I would say is this: not only the escalation and the stop for violence is urgent, I believe, but also it is urgent to reopen the channels for dialogue and negotiations that for too long have been neglected now. And I believe that this escalation now is a demonstration of the fact that the status quo is not sustainable, and that violence is probably coming back in a cyclical manner if it is not addressed by a serious multilateral negotiation that I believe could now find some space to restart. I believe this is a conflict to which several parties know what the end game could be if the political will and the right actors and players engage in a serious negotiation. So I hope that this will be the right time to do that.
Thank you both very much. We could obviously spend the entire hour discussing the Middle East, but it's also very important that we not lose sight of what is happening in Afghanistan. And to introduce this discussion, I want to just describe the work that we have all been doing together over the past 8 months. The Atlantic Council and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund have jointly conducted a trilateral strategic dialogue that brought together more than 25 distinguished diplomats, military officers, analysts, and civil society leaders from the US, Europe, and Afghanistan to work together to define a shared strategic vision for a peaceful, prosperous, and sovereign Afghanistan. We were honored that Secretary Albright, Rector Mogherini, and Shahrazad Akbar, the chairperson of the Independent Human Rights Commission of Afghanistan, 3 women, it is important to note, agreed to serve as the co-chairs of the dialogue. And they have brought enormous wisdom, dedication, and determination to our work. We are sorry that Chairperson Akbar was unable to join us for this discussion today because of the Eid holiday. I have had the distinct privilege to serve as the facilitator of this process. And the dialogue has itself been distinctive in its trilateral design, bringing together leaders from Europe and the US with leading Afghans to develop a shared set of principles, goals, and recommendations. This approach allowed us to shift discussions away from short-term political considerations to the ways in which a fuller partnership approach can support and advance shared interests and values over the long term. While the announced withdrawal of all coalition forces before September 11th certainly presents significant new challenges, our dialogue has focused on the full range of diplomatic, security, and financial levers that can be employed in partnership with the Afghan people to advance an integrated and durable peace and security framework. The road ahead will certainly not be easy, but the challenges are not insurmountable if the transatlantic community redefines its partnership with Afghanistan and commits to use the full array of non-military tools that are available. On April 23rd, we released a transatlantic charter on sovereignty, security, and development in Afghanistan, signed by all of the dialogue participants in their personal capacities. And I think a link to this document has been posted in the chat. We have used the form of a charter to set forth a shared vision for Afghanistan's future, to articulate principles and goals for achieving this vision, and to present a set of commitments we call on the transatlantic community to make in partnership with the Afghan people in the coming months and years. The introduction to the charter, written by the three co-chairs, identifies a coordinated set of near-term actions that are urgently needed to mitigate the likely political and security consequences of the withdrawal of forces. They also align with the long-term vision, and these include ongoing financial and technical support for the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, a redoubling of sustained high-level regional diplomacy to advance a peaceful settlement to the conflict, utilizing all levers of influence to secure an end to the violence that has taken tens of thousands of Afghan lives, plus several thousand American and other forces fighting alongside our Afghan allies, and developing a long-term partnership approach for this new chapter in Afghan history with a specific focus on the extraordinary generation of emerging Afghan leaders, young women and men who have the vision, dedication, and talent to build the sovereign, secure, democratic, and prosperous Afghanistan of the future. The dominant narrative about Afghanistan today focuses on the very profound challenges the country faces. They are undeniable, but this narrative misses the generational change that is transforming the country. And it is with these young leaders in mind that we have issued the Transatlantic Charter that we're going to discuss today. So I'm going to take the first 30 minutes or so to pose some questions to Secretary Albright and Rector Mogherini, and then we will take questions from our audience. So please be thinking of your questions and post them in the Q&A function in the Zoom. We ask you not to use the chat, but Q&A. So my first question is really to both of you. You have been engaged as co-chairs in this strategic dialogue since the fall. And both of you have stressed the importance of reinvigorating a transatlantic partnership with Afghanistan. But we're now in a new environment with the recently announced troop withdrawal, and we are already seeing some of the negative consequences we discussed during our deliberations. The attack last weekend on a girls' school is the most horrific recent example. In this context, I'd like to ask you both, why is the work of this dialogue, why is a transatlantic partnership still important? How can it help advance the future of peace in Afghanistan in this new reality? Secretary Albright, could we start with your thoughts?
Yes, and I would really like to thank you, Stephen, and the support of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund for this, because your personal interest and dedication to this issue has been evident for a long time, and having your wisdom and support has been essential. And the Atlantic Council, which I think is very important for this particular message, which is that it's a transatlantic issue. And I'm delighted to be able to have been doing this with my good friend, Federica Mogherini. We've known each other now for quite some time, and having that input of looking at it from a transatlantic approach, I think is absolutely essential. I think in many ways, and by the way, I think we need to tell those listening to us, we had prepared to unveil this whole thing just before the announcement that was made by the Biden administration. And there were questions of now what? And in many ways, it's even more important because this is something that is visible in every single way, every day, that we have been concerned about the things that were happening in Afghanistan before, and that clearly are now even more front and center, if that's possible, given how much attention we've all paid to Afghanistan. And I do think that your description of our areas of focus explain why I think this continues to be key, which is that we do have to support the Afghan National Defense Security Forces. You know, they have been used to having the support of the US with our NATO partners. And now they are trying to figure out how to deal when those military assets are being kind of taken further away. They haven't been totally removed, but they are not geographically right next door. I think also that it's very important to strengthen the key institutions, because the Afghans do ultimately have to run themselves and be ones that can really have that kind of stability and cultivate the rule of law and sustain development. And then I do think, and we've talked about this a lot, and I hope we can examine this more, is having more regional diplomatic process. That Afghanistan, by location, is in an incredibly complicated place. And I think that we need to figure out how to include them. And I think really, and we have been talking also about the whole, we can't make peace on the backs of the women, who in fact had gained some traction in terms of how to be respected within Afghan society, and the youth. And I do think there's a very big agenda. And I believe that this is the right time for us to be very involved and state the case very, very clearly. The Taliban have a choice to make. They can be pragmatic, or they can be permanent pariahs. And I think we'll probably talk about that more, but I did just want to get it out there, is that they have a choice. Their role is obviously very important. And the bombing of the school, and they haven't claimed responsibility for it, but even after this, I think is a sign that we have a lot to do and worry about.
Thank you very much. Director Mogherini, so the US made, in essence, a unilateral decision to withdraw its troops. It was through a consultative process, but the decision was firm. And it also meant then that because the US had the largest amount of troops in Afghanistan, that the NATO allies and others had to make the decision to withdraw their forces as well. So from the point of view of a European leader, what do you think is next in terms of the European engagement with Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, let me join Madeleine in thanking you, Stephen, personally for having gathered this group and having given Madeleine, myself, and Shahrazad the possibility to contribute to this work. I think it is indeed today much more important, even more important than it was last fall, exactly because today we're facing challenges and risks. Well, the Afghans, first and foremost, are facing challenges and risks that are even more serious and urgent and pressing than they were a few months ago. And what you just mentioned, the fact that in practical terms, the US decision to withdraw troops was taken unilaterally, even if in consultation with the NATO allies, and formalized somehow in the NATO context, which was in itself an important gesture, but still the content of the decision was made in Washington clearly. This underlines how important it is that across the Atlantic, we work together with Afghanistan and on Afghanistan. So the idea of having a trilateral approach to the future of Afghanistan, I think, is even more important today. And our responsibility to try and accompany this phase that is going to be extremely delicate, I think it's even bigger today, because there is not only the risk that the Afghans will be exposed to more violence on the ground, especially girls and women, and civic activists and human rights activists, civil society NGOs, all those that have been engaging with the Western forces on the ground today risk much more than all the other Afghans. And obviously we have a moral responsibility and an interest to find a way together to protect their lives. I think this is the basic element we need to work on together, but also try to make sure that the Afghan institutions and the Afghan people, starting from women and the younger generation, don't feel that the withdrawal of troops translates into a withdrawal of support. Mm-hmm. That they feel and they are aware that both the United States and Europe are at their side to find alternative ways, given this decision, to first of all guarantee the support to the Afghan security forces, guarantee security on the ground, bring in aid that will be necessary, secure the aid, because obviously this is also an important factor. And most of all, support the legitimate institutions in a very difficult and challenging peace process. And on top of it, what Madeleine rightly mentioned, trying to open the door for a regional dynamic that is different than the one we've seen so far. So it's a very dense agenda. And if we don't go for it together, Europeans and Americans, there's absolutely no way this is going to happen, any of this. So somehow we are at the crossroads, maybe a self-inflicted crossroad, but still we are here. And I think that the real difference on the future of Afghanistan will be determined by the level of ownership that the Afghans will be able to take on their future, and the level of joint support and coordinated support that Europeans and Americans will manage to put in place.
Thank you. As I noted, and you both have noted as well, we miss Shahrazad Akbar being with us today. So let me ask you first, Rector Mogherini. During the course of the 8 months of our work, we heard from our Afghan colleagues in great detail about their views of things. What were the most important contributions that you heard, or what are the most important takeaways from the Afghan voices in our deliberations?
Question, because what was most striking for me, especially at the very beginning, was the sense of urgency, the dramatic sense of urgency that all our Afghan friends were sharing with us about the dramatic situation on the ground and the real risk that they are running in terms of exposing their lives and the lives of their families and loved ones. Because as well, we started with a brief comment on the Middle East. In the world of today, with such a proliferation of crises and conflicts, it's easy to lose sight of what it means to live in Afghanistan today and work on women's rights, human rights, but even representing your country in Doha for the negotiations. We've heard many voices of courageous people that were at the very beginning telling us, we are exposed, our lives are at risk. And this is a perception that if you are far away from there, you don't necessarily have today, because it doesn't hit the news every day. But the increase of violence, I think, was for me the most striking first element that they were sharing with, and the sense of urgency: protect us, don't leave us alone. And this, I think, gives us again a responsibility and an interest to do so. And the second element that was striking for me, well, it was not really striking, but it's a reminder, the diversity of the voices of the Afghan interlocutors we had, because we tend to think, you know, it's one. Like in America or in Europe, you have a diversity of voices, of positions. And I think that we have somehow the duty to respect the fact that the Afghan landscape has developed in a way that pluralism inside the Afghan negotiating camp even is differentiated, is a variety of positions. There is a richness and not a weakness. It's somehow one of the gains of this last years that has managed to open the door for a certain level of freedom and participation in Afghanistan. And then last thing is the sense of need for ownership. That I think also gives us a responsibility. This is something I had detected and felt in these last 2-3 years a lot in Kabul. And every time I was talking with Afghan friends, the sense of, on one side, being afraid of being left alone, and on the other side, being afraid of not being heard. So what is my power on my future? What is my power on the future of my country? And I think this sense of wanting to have the destiny of their country in their hands and being enabled and empowered to play a decisive role there is also a request for us to support now the legitimate institutions and the civil society and the women and the youth of the country in what will be a really challenging time.
Exactly. Secretary Albright, you have such a long history with Afghanistan. And obviously now there is a great deal of worry that Afghanistan is going to be abandoned, and not just from a security standpoint, but from the standpoint of financial support, ongoing financial support for the Afghan military, and ongoing development assistance for the economy. And we're going to continue to have counterterrorism concerns. So I'd like to ask you what you think are the key variables that are needed to prevent the collapse of Afghanistan's security infrastructure, and why is the continuation of aid necessary? And do you think Congress is going to appropriate the required funds?
Well, you pointed out I've been involved with this for a very long time, and the world has, frankly. But my involvement began when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and I was in the Carter administration. And it was something that obviously became an agenda item of major proportions in terms of what the long-term, medium, short, and long-term goal of the Soviet Union was, frankly. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was the national security advisor who understood exactly kind of where the Soviets were going with issues. And it really impacted not only what was going on in Afghanistan, but also in the Middle East. And so there was kind of this, what happens in Afghanistan really does spread to other places. Then the issue became, when I was in the ambassador to the United Nations, was really what were the further roles that whom should we recognize? How does this work? Because the Taliban was gaining power, and the Taliban, in many ways, didn't want anything to do with the women. And one of the things that I remember, I visited a camp in Peshawar where it was full of women who had had to escape some of the things that were going on, with the most horrendous stories. And I will never forget, and this sticks in my brain all the time, which is I was with them and I said, I will never let you down. And so telling their story and being clear to people that even though we have all been involved with Afghanistan a long time, we can't just abandon it. I mean, and then we can have many discussions about what was done right or wrong vis-a-vis Afghanistan by previous administrations. But I do think that in this world where we now do know everything that's going on everywhere, there is some responsibility of the international community to help. And Afghanistan historically has been an issue, and it continues to be, and we need to continue to pay attention. The problem is the following, and I think that Federica, you probably have same issues in terms of European domestic populations and where aid and assistance goes, and there are many refugees everywhere and all kinds of things, that the United States is in a situation where there are questions all the time about why do we care about X? Why should we be involved in these particular things? And so I think it's going to be very important, as first of all, is in our charter, but also what the Biden administration actually has said is that we wouldn't abandon Afghanistan, that we would continue to be supportive in the ways that we've already described in terms of off-territory military support, but also with economic support, and that we would continue to try to be helpful in terms of some kind of negotiations that are going on. And so the question will be, frankly, when there are so many issues that are out there for the American people to deal with, and a budget where there are questions now about how we deal with the response to COVID, how to keep making the argument that we continue to care about what is going on in Afghanistan. And so that will be part of, I think, of what we need to keep doing through our your help and the strategic dialogue. And the transatlantic part is that it isn't just the United States doing this, that this is with our European partners, but it is going to be something we have to keep talking about. We can't just abandon it. And then finally, I think that even for those of us that are really, we're more than spectators, but who have been looking at this for a long time, the political situation within the democratic forces in Afghanistan is very complicated, which is something that we did learn from our Afghan friends that Federica pointed to, where there is disagreement about who really is in charge and should there be an interim government and when should the next elections be held and how do they resolve the various political issues that they have. So, and I do think the US can't just walk away from that, nor can our European allies. So this is a matter of keeping our eye on the ball, I think, and we're going to have to. I think that the things that we've learned from each other as a result of this dialogue, it's clear to us, but now we have to translate this to a larger message.
Exactly. And it's both a moral argument on the one hand, but it's also an argument about our own national self-interest, because chaos in the region, again, is not in our interest nor anyone else, including Europe, of course.
Absolutely. And if I can, Stephen, react to that point. I think in Europe, this is a little bit less of an issue maybe now. It was a few years ago, but I think that Europeans today understand a little bit better that it is indeed a matter of self-interest, that of supporting or contributing or indeed dedicating aid, even in a difficult budgetary situation, because the economic recovery in Europe will be difficult after COVID. But I think the refugee crisis has had on Europe this effect that Europeans woke up to the reality that whatever happens far away from home has both a security impact on Europe and also an impact on the flow of refugees and migrants that finally try to come to Europe. And in general terms, the destabilization of regions as critically important and strategically important like that one also has a negative effect on trade and communication, which is also a vital self-interest for Europe and America. So I think that Europeans now understand much better that there is a direct interest we have on investing in stability, peace, and democracy and human rights in other parts of the world. But it's a tough argument to keep on the agenda, and especially with the recovery after COVID. I think we will have to struggle quite a lot to keep budget lines adequate to the challenge, indeed.
Yes,
I think also, Stephen, I think we have to keep in mind the geographical location and other things that are going on. You know, where are the Chinese? Where are the Russians? What about Central Asia itself that is also composed of a number of complex societies and countries? And so there's, from the perspective of the larger international environment, this is central. There's no question. It may be far away, but in so many ways, it involves a number of the discussions that we have about where the 21st century is going.
You know, I had a personal experience, I think it was in 2015, when there was a real significant wave of refugees trying to reach Europe. And I was actually in Belgrade in Serbia, and there were refugees kind of stuck. And I went down to the train station area, and there were these refugees essentially camping out. And I started trying to chat with some of them, and I came across a family who had walked to Belgrade all the way from Afghanistan. That's how desperate the situation was and how desperate it can become again. But Secretary Albright, your important point about the region, let me ask Rector Mogherini, you've had a lot of experience dealing with the regional powers. And I wonder what you see as the prospects for a joined up kind of transatlantic approach to building a consensus in the region and among the other key powers to push for an end to this conflict. What kinds of positive and negative levers can be utilized to induce the key regional governments, most notably Pakistan, to take necessary steps to support peace? And at the same time, how do you assess the potential role for the UN in this process?
I think that this new phase that will be opened up in this next coming months will be, it will be even more important to see how we manage to, let's put it this way, incentivize countries in the region to do no harm on one side and contribute positively on the other side. And I think we do have together, the United States and Europe, we do have some positive leverage for sure in terms of trade agreements, cooperation agreements, partnership agreements that we have with the region, different countries in the region, including Pakistan, but not only. And also we do have some negative incentives, some negative leverage, let's put it this way, some leverage that we can use in negative terms. Not only on the countries in the region, but also on the Taliban themselves. I think that one of the things that are more interesting for the Taliban is the perspective of being delisted as a terrorist organization. And I think that this is one of the leverages we have in our hands, not to let it go until a clear result is achieved at the negotiating table. In terms of the role of the regional powers, I think they are extremely diversified among themselves. As you mentioned, Pakistan has a key role to play to, as I said, try to abstain from doing any harm, but also to try and push the Taliban in the right direction. And that is the direction that Madeleine was mentioning. They do have a choice. It's actually now in their interest to go in the direction of negotiating and sharing power, because this would be their way to be in power and in relation with the international community. Obviously, it has not been their traditional approach, but Pakistan, I think, has an interest in stabilizing Afghanistan for its own stability and its own security. And I think that there is probably a domestic dynamic we need to look at between the political and the military power. And for sure, the United States and Europe together can help Pakistan to find the way to contribute to stability and security in the region, which is positive also for Pakistan, including from a security and economic point of view. And then there's the other neighbors, and I think that here Central Asian countries, and in particular I think of Uzbekistan, can play a constructive role, probably a little bit more behind the scenes, but with a level of trust and connection inside Afghanistan that can be extremely helpful, both in terms of religious connections and political connections and family even connections, tribes, that I think could contribute to open or accompany negotiations in a useful manner. Then you have another neighbor that so far has been relatively quiet on the Afghan front, but we'll need to see if that continues, that is Iran. Obviously, Iran is used to think strategically, and so any decision that Iran takes is always connected to other decisions it takes, being it Syria, being it the Middle East, being it the nuclear deal. So that will need to be considered. And this is why I think it is important for the Europeans and the Americans to work together, because Europe has a direct access to Iran that is a little bit more difficult for the United States still. And then there are the non-neighbors. Well, one is a neighbor for a small portion of border, but the big powers of the region, China and Russia, I believe that they do have today, maybe contrary than to the past, both a security and economic interest in getting Afghanistan right, let's put it this way. I don't think they have an interest in seeing turmoil in Afghanistan. And for sure, my guess is that they would try to play their own game, to try and open a way for some sort of stabilization and security in Afghanistan. Now, if that will happen inside the UN framework or not, this needs to be seen. And this leads to the question you put. The role of the United Nations in principle is today more important than ever. Will it be at the level of the expectations and the needs that we have? I hope so, because this is the moment when not only the transatlantic community has an interest and a duty, I believe, a responsibility to come together to support Afghanistan, but also there would be a need to have a larger umbrella that gathers not only the transatlantic community, but also the regional powers, the permanent members of the Security Council, different other players in Asia and elsewhere, to come together and try to contribute to the success of Afghanistan. And I think that it is also important in our charter that we define some ideas or indicate some ideas about how to support the negotiations that they would not need to be forgotten now, because we risk to otherwise focus only on the security and the development side and forget that the real political solution to this is the negotiations and the peace agreements.
Secretary Albright is a former UN ambassador. Do you think the appointment of Jean Arnaud as the personal representative of the Secretary General to undertake a mission of high level and sustained regional diplomacy is going to be sufficient? Do you think that will help get the parties to negotiate seriously about a political settlement to this conflict?
I think that it is always a very good sign when there is a personal envoy from the Secretary General on anything, but it is not the only thing. And what has to happen is that Secretary General's envoy has a channel back to New York and to the Security Council. And one of the things that I remember from my own presence there is the reports that come from the field to the Security Council do make a difference. They clearly also have, there's a political context, but on the other hand, I think when everybody hears what is going on, the thing that worries me is that there are a couple of countries that do have veto power, that do have something that they have an interest in the region, which is Russia and China. And therefore, I think there need to be some other discussions informally with the envoy and others to make sure that we're on the same wavelength. Because it seems to me that neither of those countries do want to see turmoil in that region generally, but whether we're all on the same wavelength. So I think this is going to take a lot of diplomacy and a lot of action. And I think the issue goes something to what we were talking about earlier, is whether people are tired of hearing about Afghanistan. And that it seems that it's been going on, well, since the last century with the Great Game and things. And so it has been an area of conflict. But it is important to keep it out there and to personalize it, which is why I do think we need to talk more about the women and also about the young people and then the young people's needs for education and jobs and being a part of things and making it more real and human to people. And I think that is something that we can do. And I also, back to something, I mean, you specifically use the term charter for this, because it was kind of a harking back to things after World War II or during World War II with the Atlantic Charter, where in fact countries that agreed with each other were able to put their hopes out there and have, if not a roadmap, then an aspirational map of where we need to go. So I think it's something that has to be kept in the news. And by the way, we haven't talked about another part. You mentioned it briefly with somebody who walked from Afghanistan to Belgrade, but there are now going to be large numbers of refugees, which is an issue that we all are dealing with across the board in a number of areas. And then there are those very specifically people that were helpful to the United States and other NATO partners in terms of translations and various things. And they are under some threat, frankly, at this point. So we have to figure that out then. As I think people have read, there are questions about the security of our embassies and our diplomats and how many people do we have there. And so there are any number of different aspects that may seem like kind of details, but are integral to the story and how we work together. And I also do think, absolutely, as you pointed out, this was an American unilateral decision with some consultation, but there needs to be much more interaction with our allies on how we proceed to deal with the larger questions that we were talking about, regional diplomacy or support, but also these very practical day and day out decisions that have to be made about those who continue to live there and about whom we care.
Exactly. Well, you've addressed one of the questions that's come in from the audience already in your comments about those Afghans who stood shoulder to shoulder with American and international forces and served us, and who may be at grave risk if the Taliban take more and more territory. So I want to turn now to more questions from our friends in the audience. And here's one that we've touched on a little bit, but this is a little bit more specific. The question is, with the US pulling out of Afghanistan, what risks does that pose for China moving in and gaining more influence, for example, in funding infrastructure projects? Either Rector Mogherini or Secretary Albright?
I can start if you want. I think that, well, China has started already to invest and plan investments, not only in Afghanistan, but also across the region, across the Central Asian countries, and the entire Belt and Road Initiative goes through there. And Pakistan is one of the key players there. So who has real leverage on Pakistan is China. So somehow, if the worry is, and Madeleine mentioned that in the very beginning, if the worry is what kind of geopolitical impact this will have on the power balance in Asia, well, I'm afraid the answer is quite easy. Obviously, this opens the door for China even more to exercise its power. The only hope we can have is that it uses it for good, that it uses this to incentivize peace and security, and not otherwise, which is quite probable because China's investments need security also. So if we want to see it on the bright side, we might say Chinese investments create an interest for China to try and push on those on which it has leverage, and namely Pakistan, to contribute to an outcome that guarantees security and security. I was about to say and human rights and democracy, but for obvious reasons, I stopped one step before that, because I guess that priority for China is to ensure security on the ground, enough to run projects and infrastructures, but not necessarily to promote an open system of democracy and respect of human rights.
Another question, maybe for you, Secretary Albright. What role does opium production and also corruption play in this situation, and how do we address those as we're trying to get to a peaceful and prosperous future?
Well, it actually does play a fairly large role, because it has been kind of the agricultural activity that has brought some sense of stability to the people that have been involved in it, frankly. And even though we would all like to see the abolishment of opium growing, of poppies, it has been something that has stabilized a whole region. I think what the corruption associated with it is obviously an additional aspect, in addition to obviously dependency upon it. And it does have to be something that is very much in the minds of those that are trying to figure out what the next steps are for a democratic Afghanistan, or one that does have an elected government that is recognized by its own people and the neighbors. But it is very much a part of the issue, because from everything that I've read, it is one of the kind of staples in many ways of an agricultural economy. So there's a lot that needs to be thought about as we go forward. This is a multi-problemed, the whole issue, the more we talk about it, there is really a combination of problems that impact upon each other. And as you solve one, it doesn't solve everything. And it's something that I've talked about generally as I try to teach about national security policy, which is the billiard ball effect. People think that diplomacy is a game of chess, which is two people sitting quietly thinking up their moves. It's not chess, it's pool, it's billiards, where somebody steps up to the table and thinks that they're going to knock a ball into a pocket on the other side. But on the way of getting there, it knocks a bunch of other balls, and it's very dynamic and horizontal. And that is something that's going on within Afghanistan, and also the regional ones, as you talk about China or Pakistan, or we haven't even talked about India, and Central Asia. It is definitely the billiard ball effect.
That is for sure. Here's a question that is addressed to you, Rector Mogherini. Is NATO asking Pakistan again to provide air bases near to the Afghan border to have some sort of influence after a complete troop withdrawal? Influence, obviously, for terrorism and for the Taliban influence. Recently, the German foreign minister visited Pakistan. Is this part of the thinking?
To my knowledge, and I want to specify, obviously, I do not represent NATO, but to my knowledge and for what I have observed, there is now some thinking about where to deploy some support forces in the region, in the area. I am not 100% sure that this is done at NATO level or at the US level. I assume that this is in the first place done at the US level. My understanding is that it would be very difficult for any European military force to stay around, if not together with the United States. I wouldn't see Europeans engaging in the region as a support force, if not jointly with the United States, for different reasons of public opinion support, but also of capability and having the right, mainly I would say for operational reasons and also for narrative reasons. But I think that the search for bases around Afghanistan is not going to be the easiest one, because there is a story there, there is a history there. Some countries have had difficulties with NATO bases or US bases deployed on their territory in the past. That has created a lot of controversies and even some constitutional changes in some Central Asian countries. So I think that the issue will be handled quite cautiously from the countries in the region, especially if they intend to play some kind of role in supporting or launching diplomatic talks. I think they would be extremely careful in not being perceived as I would say, an agent of the Transatlantic alliance in the region. If they want, sorry for using an expression that for sure someone in Afghanistan would use, but I think especially the countries that would try to play some diplomatic role will also be extremely cautious in not being perceived as anything different from an honest broker. And so I think it would be challenging to find a place to stay. And I think, to my knowledge, it's more of a US exercise at this stage. Also a natural consequence of the fact that the decision to withdraw was American, and somehow I would assume that the European approach now is to say, okay, you decided to leave, and now you tell us what you intend to do next before we decide if we do it together or not.
Here's another question from the audience. Both of you have talked about Pakistan and incentives. Pakistan is supporting the Taliban. Pakistan gives the Taliban safe haven. And at the same time, the US supplies arms to Pakistan and lots of other forms of economic assistance. What about sanctions on Pakistan to encourage better behavior with regard to Afghanistan?
Well, I think that we need to, practice more positive in terms of saying that this is an opportunity for Pakistan to really play a key role, not in terms of undermining the situation, but in terms of being part of the solution. The history of Pakistan and the Taliban and Osama bin Laden and all that is a pretty sad one. And I have to say also, one of the aspects of our American relationships with Pakistan is a very complicated one in terms of them seeing us as fair weather friends. And one of the other things whoever asked this may regret this, because I sometimes teach about it, which is that what has happened is Congress got very involved in putting some automatic sanctions on Pakistan if they went forward to develop a nuclear weapon, or if they had a coup. And both those things happened, and it created a difficulty in terms of U.S.-Pakistani relationships. And then we give assistance, and I mean, literally it goes back and forth. And some of it also depends on their relationship with India. So I think we have to I would like to see us have more of a positive approach towards Pakistan and saying, you know, you are a major player in this. This is your chance to really be on a side where we are dealing with a long-term problem positively and not undermine it.
And over the long term, Pakistan has economic incentives to have a peaceful neighbor with whom it can trade and connect. And we can only hope that we can persuade them to see the benefits that can come. We're nearing the end of our time, and this has been a terrific conversation. The title of this program, and this will be, I think, the final question. The title of this program is Hope Amid Uncertainty. I want to ask you both, given the uncertainty, given the difficult situation, what gives you hope?
Well,
you go first.
Well, let me just say, it is my basic approach to things, being an optimist, but I'm an optimist who worries a lot. So I think we have to figure out what are the things that make us worry so that we can have the hope, because I think we are in a different era in so many different ways. And there are lessons to be learned from past times with that part of the world. But I think we have to approach it from a 21st century look at it in terms of new technology, in terms of new desires by people, and what can be not operating in the fear factor, but the hope factor. But it's going to require cooperation. And that's why I'm so glad that thanks to you and the Atlantic Council, we are looking at this as a transatlantic issue. It's not just the European responsibility, it's not just our responsibility, but it's democratic countries acting together to try to solve problems for people that have been victims of great power plays for a very long time.
Thank you. Rector Mogherini, what gives you hope?
I have to admit that when I've seen the title of this conversation we're having today, I thought, well, this is an extreme exercise of optimism, because in the middle of what is happening now in Afghanistan and what will happen in the coming months, you really have to be a very energetic optimist to find the hope in the uncertainty. But I am an optimist as well. Having said that, in this moment on Afghanistan, I feel more worries and even fear than hope at this stage, because I think that we're risking a lot, and that the risk of having the country going backwards is real and extremely worrying. But if there is one element that gives me hope, is the people of Afghanistan, is the younger generation, is the women. Exactly for this reason, they are targeted, because the Taliban are trying to kill the hope that is now flourishing in their own country. They can be the strongest element of guarantee that Afghanistan will not go backwards on women's rights, on girls' rights, on education, on democracy. But it will be uphill.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both for participating in this forum, and I also want to take this opportunity to express my personal gratitude to each of you for co-chairing this process, and to say what a pleasure it has been to work with you both. And I look forward to our continued work together, because as we know, this work is not finished. And there will be a full report of our dialogues published by the Atlantic Council in the weeks ahead. But my thanks to you both. It's been such a great pleasure and honor to work with you. And let me turn this back over to Philippe-Jan. And again, thank you for hosting all of us.
Well, thank you. So let me be very quick. Thank you, Madeleine Albright, Federica Mogherini, and Stephen Heintz. So really pleased that you were able to join us and to get your insights on this really critical issue. that's top of mind. And to those of you who attended, thank you for being with us too. We hope you enjoyed today's program. We hope to see you at the next Pacific Council World Affairs Global Speakers Forum, and we'll let you know about that. And let me just close with saying, please stay safe, stay well. For those of you who haven't, please get vaccinated, and please have a great rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
A pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, my pleasure.
So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Okay, I hope to.